say anything about his language design that someone hasn't already said, I'm sure.
Well, that's why I'm not talking about his language design. I'm talking about post-Larry language design. Okay, so welcome everyone to my talk about language design in a Perl without Larry. First, a disclaimer: this talk is about processes, not about people. I'm discussing a lot of, things that happened, like changes that have happened over the last 10, 15 years. These involve people, and thus discussing them. People who were involved can have emotions about it, but I don't think the court there are some problems, but the problems are processes, not people. So I'm trying not to talk about people. Also, a lot of this is a rant. A good rant is a rant for something, not per se against something. It's meaning to inspire change, because well, I care, and you are all here, so I assume all of you are caring. So, what caused this presentation? Well, we had an incident last December where people were trying to change Smartmatch. And this Smartmatch 2.0 was not a success. I think there are 3 reasons for that. The first reason was it pretty much broke everything around Smartmatch. It broke all of when, it broke almost all of non-when Smartmatch. This had a lot of damage, and not all of this was not well received. The second reason was this new Smartmatch wasn't really anything that people actually wanted. It broke a lot of stuff, but the new version was very confusing. I don't know how many of you read my blog post about it, but can you please raise your hand if you know the difference between where is and where so? Well, yeah.
For the recording, how many hands?
0. And it was also fairly useless without a helper library, which kind of defeats the point. And the third reason, and probably the most important reason why thing that was a problem, was this caught everyone off guard. When I wrote a blog post about it, it was already merged into master, and almost no one knew about it. I suspect even on P5P most people hadn't realized it yet. So yeah, how does this happen? What kind of processes do we have now, have we had in the past decade, and where should we go? Well, let's start in a time when we still had Larry in Perl 5, the old days. We actually have a nice policy document, and in this document, it wasn't committed by Larry, but it very much sounded like something Larry would say. The process is described, and Larry's role is described in American terms as the Supreme Court. He's not the one that he was not the one that like, hello, I'm talking about you.
I'm not here.
It describes his role as the Supreme Court. He's the one that, in case of doubt, makes the decision: is this okay or not? But not necessarily the one who made the daily decisions. And this seems to have worked well for quite a while. Yeah, but then something happened, and this thing involved mugs and walls and well, I think you all know that story. So after this came an RFC process. There was a request for comments. There were a lot of RFCs submitted, 361 apparently. And this resulted in a design process that was entirely new to Perl. Because this was a much more formalized process than anything we had used up to that point. And basically what Larry did is he gathered all of them and then he wrote the apocalypses. Now this sounds very scary, but apocalypse is just a Greek word for revelation. And and in these he described all these RFCs, and if he accepted them, rejected them, changed them. Then he wrote the synopsis, which is essentially a proper language description without the entire context of the RFCs. And then there were the exegesis, which is just another word for an explanation. I think Damien wrote them. This was an entirely new process for Perl, and this was an enormous volume of requests for changes. In hindsight, it's fairly logical that we got this split, Perl 5, Perl 6 split, even though at the start of the process this wasn't quite the intention. And one of the most obvious consequences of this split is that Larry focused on Perl 6 and not so much on Perl 5. But our language design process wasn't quite adapted for this yet. One of the things this led to, this is particularly notable in Perl 5.10, is the age of feature stealing. When you go through the list of changes in 5.10, then you can summarize most of it as, this thing in Perl 6 looked nice, let's port it to Perl 5. And this is a very different process. This is more like a Larry by proxy. And it had a very mixed results. I mean, some of them are good. I think everyone loves defined or. If you're not, then you're just wrong and go to another conference. I think most people also like say it's not doesn't make the big difference that defined or make, but I think it's fairly uncontroversial. And some of it was not so good. I think there's a general consensus that Smartmatch in Perl 5 is problematic in a lot of ways. You can argue which ways exactly. If you ask people what it should look like, then generally they're not agreeing at all. But I think everyone by now is agreeing that Smartmatch is not the thing we had hoped it would be. And there's some of it is just ugly. We had some new regex features. Just for my curiosity, can you raise your hands if you've ever used define in a regex? Okay, this is a couple of hands, not an enormous amount, but a couple. Can you raise your hands if you ever used the control flow features like mark, fail, skip? This is more than I expected, actually. I mean, I've never used them. I think I like them being there, but it's not a bad feature. It's just that almost no one is using it. So lessons from 5.10. Size matters, and this is a general pattern that's also true in a lot of later Perl versions, in my opinion. A lot of the small additions that you can explain in like one sentence or two sentences have been very successful, and a lot of the larger features, not so much. I mean, the R modifier in 5.14 is another example of this. It's a very small addition, but it actually can make a difference in daily or weekly timescales. So yeah, now I'm skipping a few releases because I have a limited amount of time. 5.18. In 5.18, we had realized some things that we hadn't realized up until then. And in this time in between, another important change was the camel book. Now you may wonder, why is this so important? Well, because when Tom Christensen was working on it, he was rigorously documenting all the new features, including Smartmatch. And he was probably the first person who actually realized how insane our Smartmatch feature was, because he was actually documenting in detail, and then he realizes, oh, this thing when isn't always smart matching, but the conditions when it is and isn't aren't well described, and some of them are rather surprising. My favorite example, if you do when and then a regex, it does not do smart match. It does, it's essentially just an if, but because regex is default to matching against $_, it all looks as if it smart matches as long as $_ is a string. There are a lot of other, the exact rules are very specific and too complex for me to explain right now. But this is one of those things that we hadn't really realized because our design process didn't adequately describe how this should work. So yeah, in 5.18 we introduced something new, and that's one of the most important changes in our process of the last decade. We added experimental warnings to all new features. These would be added for at least 2 releases, and this gave us some leeway of changing or even deleting the feature entirely. Officially, this was sort of our policy before, but it wasn't, well, without the warnings, it was not always as obvious to the end user. And controversially, these were also applied to Smartmatch, even though Smartmatch had been released about half a decade earlier. Because at that point, we figured maybe we should change a few things about Smartmatch. We didn't agree then on what, but so yeah. And this thing that we're currently using, I would describe this as Agile language design. We're kind of optimizing on we might fuck up, so let's create some room to change this later. I don't know how many of you saw, is Curtis here in the room? No, he isn't. Oh, some of you may have seen his presentation 2 years ago about when you should do Agile and when not. Perl 5 is not really in a stage where like doing this Agile to me is a very good idea. It's still better than what we did in the period before. But personally, I very much believe that we should do more upfront design. Somehow. Another part of the problem is how do they get in? Well, the secret of how a lot of changes happen is very simple. There are two kinds of people in P5P. They're like talkers, the peanut gallery. They have lots of ideas and nothing ever happens, and there are doers who write code, usually don't talk as much. And in a lot of cases, if you want, well, in all cases, really all cases, if you want to get anything done, you're going to have to write the code yourself. And this is fine. One thing of the current dynamic that I'm not so fond of is that in a lot of cases, this also means you're posting something, it gets warnocked, you merge it.
What does it mean, Warnock? Explain more what's dilemma. Please explain more.
Oh, Warnock's dilemma is basically you post something, no one reacts, and then you're guessing, does this mean that everyone agrees? Or everyone thinks it's so stupid that it's not worth replying? Or is everyone busy? You don't know. But no one is responding.
Thank you.
So yeah, and the whole just merging it works fine for bug fixes, in particular because a lot of the active contributors on P5P are domain experts. They're the most knowledgeable person in this area anyway. And it sounds very scary because, you know, in theory you want a lot of review. In practice, this works out fine for most things. It doesn't quite work that way for language design. And this is one of the reasons why we ended up with the recent Smartmatch change. There was it kind of got warnocked, and then it got merged, and then only afterwards people really noticed. So yeah. My apologies if this is too soon. Language design is like Brexit.
Yeah.
You need a plan. Almost any plan is better than no plan. But there's this other thing that tends to get lost in our current process, that has been lost for the last decades. Language design is like sex. Just like sex, language design is a lot better when it's based on like enthusiastic yes. And right now, that's not how we're designing our language. We're just kind of dumping it on people. There's something happening in P5P, and then in the release notes for the next major version, we're announcing this has happened. This is much too late. We want, like, what we should be doing is announcing, we want to be doing this. Are you to the community, we want to be doing this. Are you in or not?
To do it 15 years in advance.
And only like when we really need to hear from the community, yes, we want this, or no, we don't want this. And only when they want it, then we should do it. And currently, this communication is not happening. It just isn't. P5P can be an echo chamber, and if you're not on it, and also if you're not on it on the right time scale, if you just happen to if you had just happened to be busy, like, if you happen to be busy in like the week before Christmas, then you missed this whole change with the Smartmatch. These kind of changes need to be communicated very broadly and loudly. So yeah, so what do we need? Do we need a formal process? A lot of languages, like Python and Java, have like this very well described, very formal process of change. It sounds really nice. I don't think we can graft it on the thing we have now, going from essentially no process to a very formal process. Also, formal processes need a lot of resources, and we don't necessarily have all the resources. Python has, forgot how many, like, the PEP process has like 8 or 10 editors, and like every PEP needs one of those editors, and it's a very big thing to do. I don't think we can do this right now. But yeah, we need some sort of process. And well, one thing that, for example, PEP does nicely that I think we should also copy is we need to include people from outside P5P in this discussion. But often, if you do this too early, then it becomes a peanut gallery. You can't really, you can't distribute language design well. You can do. What you can do is ask for confirmation and some feedback. And in general, like I said, you need a yes or no or a small change. And I think we need a process that's optimized for that, getting that feedback, even if we are, even if the designing still happens in a small group of people. This was the end. I don't have a lot of time left, but discussion.
Well, yeah, and I kind of go on the feed to say, I think, 2 points, which would then, I want to go on, you've got this capture mic. Just near that thing, because that's the, so what you didn't say was that Dominus did a review of the Perl 6 RFC process. And the 2 specific things I can remember that are worth saying were that many of those RFCs did not contain implementation details. They were effectively aspirational, hoping someone else would know how to do it, which a PEP process I think is better at capturing. The second thing was, it was noted that in this, Larry took most of those RFCs and said, yes, you have a genuine pain point here, but then mostly rejected their proposed design of how they would fix it and came up with a better, more coherent design. So the RFC process as done for Perl 6 would not solve it alone, and that's what I wanted to say. You need to address those two problems somehow, which I think you partially did with what you said. Thank you for...
Any questions, comments, opinions?
Also, it was good.
Totally random thought. Every major Perl release comes with a Perl Delta that says, here's what we have changed since the last release. It would only work on a yearly timescale, but what about a Perl proposed document to say, here are some thoughts that we might do in the next release, scream at us yes or no by this time next year?
May be helpful. I mean, I'm really not sure what kind of medium would be best for communicating this. I mean, I'm pretty sure that right now P5P is not working to get it to a broader audience for various reasons. Essentially, P5P is putting your mouth on a fire hose, and it's a lot, and most people are interested in a very specific thing and not the rest.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what I use P5P for is I'm digging into units of core Perl and somebody help me with the insights here, which again is noise that most of the community doesn't need.
Yeah.
There definitely needs to be an inward-facing side of P5P and an outward-facing side. That is the side that's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's not quite true that we do release notes every year. We do release notes every month
Oh, sure.
for development release,
Yeah.
and then still gives you the opportunity to react and gives P5P the opportunity to either retract a feature or change it.
Yeah.
And that's similar with a lot of features that are experimental that leave room to improve or remove the feature.
Yeah.
So it's not that black and white, well, it's just once a year and here are the release
No,
notes.
sure, but what I mean is that nobody writes down what we plan to do. It's always, here's what we have done. And so it never gives anyone a chance to react to, oh, you're planning to do that. And it would be nice to have a list of here are things that... Because, for example, I propose at some point to have joined respect overload package so that I can join a bunch of overload strings to get the right object back. I don't know whether anybody else would like that. And I currently don't have a way to ask the community, would you like that? So yeah, if we had a way to ask that would be nice.
Expanding on both previous points. So in essence, we learned from Perl 6's RFC process the same lesson we know from requirements engineering in general. People love to talk about proposed solutions, not their problem. It's actually quite hard to get the real problem so an expert can design a solution. So if we ask programmers for what we need to do with our programming language, we're asking the wrong people because they're not language designers, they're users. They can talk about their pain points, not about the best solution. This expands into the second point. Even what's documented in Perl Delta or the proposed, we may add this in the future. You're talking about solutions again, but nowhere in the Perl Delta does it tell me what's the actual problem that this was supposed to fix. So we also cannot judge this solution. Does it actually solve the problem? Does it solve other problems? Does it make other problems harder? So we really need to make a distinction there.
Okay, I think I've really run out of time now. Thank you all for your attention.
Go make yourself a Perl Trello board.